Bom dia, gente. Então, bom dia a todos que estão aqui presentes e aos que estão acompanhando a transmissão. Eu tenho o prazer de apresentar para vocês a doutora Caroline Fitzpatrick, que vai nos falar hoje sobre o impacto das mídias digitais no desenvolvimento de crianças e adolescentes, apresentando dados de um estudo longitudinal. A doutora Caroline Fitzpatrick é professora da Universidade de Sherbrooke e pesquisadora visitante da Universidade de Joanesburgo. Ela estuda as origens das desigualdades na educação e na saúde na infância. O objetivo da sua pesquisa é informar políticas sociais e iniciativas de saúde pública destinadas a melhorar a saúde e a educação infantil. Ela coordena o projeto Uso de Mídia Digital por Crianças e suas implicações para promover a união, uma abordagem ecossistêmica. Esse é um tema muito importante para quem trabalha com crianças e adolescentes e também com mães e pais, mesmo que não trabalhe diretamente com tecnologias digitais, já que o uso desses dispositivos pode afetar diferentes domínios do desenvolvimento e nós ainda sabemos muito pouco sobre os impactos das mídias digitais. Então, nós teremos 45 minutos de palestra e 1 hora para discussão. E no momento da discussão, as perguntas e comentários poderão ser feitos em português e haverá tradução. So, Caroline, thank you very much. It's a pleasure having you here, and you can start now.
Thank you very much, Patricia, for that lovely introduction. So, bom dia, everybody. I apologize that I cannot do this talk in Portuguese, but maybe in a year or so when I come back, we'll see. My name is Caroline Fitzpatrick. I am a professor. I am a professor at Université de Sherbrooke in the Department of Preschool and Elementary School Education. And today I'm happy to share about 10 years worth, of research with you today and some of the insights from that. So right out of the gates, I'd like to say that I do not have any conflicts of interest. So all my research is funded by Canadian federal and provincial agencies. And I think in my line of work and in my area of research, it's very important to put that forward. So I'm not funded by Google or Apple or Microsoft or any of these tech companies. And unfortunately, it's not the case for all researchers in this area. So something to always be aware of. So I am from the city of Montreal, which is in the eastern part of Canada, in the French province of Quebec. So Canada is a very big country, and we have part of Canada on the eastern board that speaks mostly French. I grew up there. I went to McGill University and Concordia University, where I studied psychology. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about my background and why I got interested in the field of digital media use by children, and then get into the research part of it. So currently I am at Université de Sherbrooke, which is about an hour and a half from Montreal, so very close, also in the French-speaking part of Canada, and it is a French language university. And it is a quite large university. It has psychology and all the main programs, a medical school and a law program, so it's a nice research-intensive university. So a little bit about my background. So I guess you could say I started my psychological trajectory, or my research trajectory in 2008 when I began a PhD under the supervision of Linda Pagani at Université de Montréal. And during this time, I was interested mainly in school readiness. So I was interested in better understanding why some children did well in early schooling and why some seemed to struggle. So I came to be very interested in the topic of executive functions and how that contributed to academic success, and also classroom engagement and how that helped children better adjust in early schooling. Following this, I went to New York University to pursue a postdoctoral degree with Clancy Blair, who is one of the first people to really study executive functions in preschoolers. So we looked at how poverty and disadvantage contribute to the development of executive functions. And we also looked at how executive functions contributed to differences in school readiness in children. I then did a second postdoctoral degree with an epidemiologist, Tracy Barnett. And Tracy and I were interested in looking at how some features and characteristics of children's schools contributed to their risk of becoming overweight and to their level of physical activity. So it's important to note that during this time, I had the opportunity to be involved as an author and co-author on a series of studies looking at how television impacts school readiness, executive functions, physical activity, and the risk of becoming overweight. And in these studies, we found some evidence that screen time and television use was a risk factor in all situations. So I tremendously enjoyed working on this topic. And I also noted that this is a topic that elicited tremendous attention from news and media, really showing how much interest parents had in the topic. So it gave me the sense that this is a real topic of social importance that people wanted to know more about. So that's sort of how I got interested in this line of research. So in 2015, I got my first professor position in Nova Scotia, Canada. So that's a different province in the east. And during this time, I started a longitudinal study during the pandemic, which I will tell you a little bit more later in the presentation. I'm currently a professor at Université de Sherbrooke, as mentioned, and I was recently awarded a Canada Research Chair Award to study the impact of digital media on children. And if you have questions about the Canada Research Chair program, I'll be happy to answer them later on. So digital media use, at least in Canada and the United States, is a topic that's often reported on by the media. So it's how children should use media, whether they should use it, and how much they should use is a continued topic of public debate, not just scientific debate, but also public debate. And to fuel some of the controversy, apparently Bill Gates and Steve Jobs admitted having raised their own children far away from screens, which kind of got a lot of people questioning media use by children. There was also a very high-profile article in The Atlantic claiming that smartphones have destroyed an entire generation. So it's a very bold and dramatic claim. And in Quebec, there are similar news stories that surface about whether screen use by teens represents a public health threat that needs to be acted on immediately. And then as technology evolves, so does the debate. So there was a recent controversy over whether voice-assisted technology like Siri and Alexa might cause developmental delays in children that use them too much. So in terms of context, and at least this is the case in many Canadian households and American households, families now have multiple devices. So gone are the days of one television per family. Now we have multiple portable and also television sets within each household. Families are also very likely to have access to Wi-Fi, to cable, to streaming services. And all this access, of course, increases not only use by children, but also increases the chances that children are going to use media without parental supervision, because everybody now has their personalized access. In addition to this, most ministers of education across Canada and the different provinces encourage the use of technology starting from kindergarten. So children are now being exposed to media and digital media starting from the first years of school. And as we've seen recently, the pandemic really caused an explosion in our use of technology and digital media as we began to use it not just for leisure, but also for socialization and for learning activities. So theoretically, we can sort of place this in an ecosystemic framework. So that's one way to understand digital media used by children and its consequences. So we can see them as being shaped by children's internal acquired and innate characteristics. The consequences of media use will also be shaped by the different interactions children have with different settings, like their family setting, their daycare setting, their school setting. But the consequences of digital media use and the development of children's habits will also be influenced by more distal factors like priorities set forth by the Minister of Education, parents' working conditions, community resources, and access to affordable leisure, cultural shift towards an information-based economy from a more industrial-based economy, as well as historical events like the pandemic. So these are all sort of influences on my topic of study. So there are current media use recommendations that are set forth by organizations like the World Health Organizations, but these are also adopted by some Canadian organizations like the Society for Physiology and Exercise, also several organizations of optometrists, so people interested in eye health, will abide by these recommendations for children. So the recommendations surrounding children's screen time are currently that children before the age of 2 should not be exposed to any screen time, that screen time be limited to 1 hour for preschoolers between the age of 2 and 5, and that screen time be limited to 2 hours a day for older children and adolescents. Now, these are recommendations that only apply to leisure screen time. So time spent on schoolwork, homework, or in class should be excluded from these recommendations. It's also important to mention that a lot of children have a hard time following these recommendations. So many children fail to abide by these. So one of the reasons that recommendations such as these exist and why they're so stringent for younger children is because we know from behavioral science and behavioral health science that the habits and preferences that we develop early in life are likely to be maintained and even intensify over time. So if we can somehow help children develop healthy media habits, moderate media habits early on, we might be able to inoculate them against some more serious health problems down the line, sedentariness, risk of becoming overweight, and so on. So today I'm going to focus on 3 of my research objectives. So first of all, what is the impact of screen time on children's development? Second, I'll talk about some research linking screen time to executive functions. And I will end by presenting some of my work on the impact of media use and the health and well-being of adolescents. So most of my work on the impact of screen time on children has been longitudinal. So here I'm going to present to you a series of studies that my colleagues and I conducted based on the same longitudinal sample. So this is a sample called the Quebec Longitudinal Study of Child Development, and it was a study of a cohort of approximately 2,000 children born between 1998 and 1999 that were followed from birth to age 20, so often annually or every 2 years. And this is a cohort of children that was considered representative of the population. So it was based on a stratified sample, representative of regions, urban and rural living, and different socio-demographic groups in the province. So in these studies, we used as a predictor, we used children's screen time at the age of 2 and at the age of 4. And we also looked at a variety of outcomes. So outcomes were reported either by parents, they were reported by teachers, sometimes by children themselves, and sometimes they were directly measured. So we had multiple informants for our outcomes, and outcomes covered physical health outcomes, cognitive functioning, as well as social functioning of the child. And finally, since this research is longitudinal and correlational, we try to include as many relevant control variables as possible. So to better isolate the potential impact of screen time on outcomes, we controlled for things like the child's sex, their temperament, whether they had baseline behavior problems, as well as certain socio-demographic characteristics of the family, like the mother's education, family configuration, and family conflict. So here are the results of these initial studies. So Here, we, as a reminder, we measured screen time during the preschool years between the ages of 2 and 4. So first off, we found that children who spent more time in front of screens during their preschool years arrived at kindergarten less well prepared. So they were less engaged in their classroom. They had lower scores on measures of vocabulary and number knowledge. They also had more interpersonal. Now, since this research was longitudinal, it was possible to follow up with these same children at the end of elementary school, at the age of 10, around 10 and 12. And what we found was that, again, the children who had spent the most time in front of screens were, again, less engaged in the classroom, were performing lower on standardized assessments of mathematics. They were more socially isolated and had more interpersonal conflict, and had also worse health habits, so worse dietary habits, tended to be less involved in physical activity, had developed lower levels of muscular strength, and were more at risk of becoming overweight or obese. So we also examined whether the quality of the contents to which children were exposed might pose additional risks to children's development. So we also looked at whether children were exposed to violent contents during the preschool years. And we found that above and beyond the time spent with screens, being exposed to violent content presented additional risks to psychosocial development in terms of more antisocial behavior, more conduct problems. And exposure to violent contents was also associated with less attention and engagement in the classroom. We've recently extended these results to the beginning of adolescence and found that these effects seem to maintain themselves over time. So preschool exposure to violence was associated with more psychosocial problems and classroom problems at age 13 as well. So I'm going to present to you some work now on screen time and executive functions. And maybe just as a reminder, because I'm not sure how familiar all of you are with executive functions, and might or might not be in your area of study. So executive functions are a collection of cognitive abilities that allow individuals to exercise willful, voluntary control over their thinking, over their behavior, and over their emotions. So they're higher order thinking skills that include cognitive flexibility, working memory, and inhibition or self-control. So cognitive flexibility allows individuals to alternate between tasks, to adjust to unforeseen circumstances, and to adjust to changes in routine. So to successfully transition from one activity to the next that might have different demands. Working memory allows people to hold information in mind for a short period of time, to manipulate it or to update it. And finally, inhibition or self-control is sort of like our psychological braking system. So it allows us to stop an automatic behavior or an impulsive behavior long enough to think about the consequences of the actions. So together, these functions are essential for planning, organizing behavior, and for anticipating consequences of our actions. So it's not surprising that executive functions are extremely narrowly related to academic achievement in early schooling. Executive functions also contribute to interpersonal success, the ability to get along well with others. And executive functions can also contribute to people's ability to adopt healthy lifestyle habits. So executive functions build throughout childhood, but if you look at the graph up here, you can probably notice that executive functions have a very quick period of development during the preschool years. So part of the speed of the development during these years is because, it's for biological reasons. So the executive functions will evolve as the prefrontal cortex develops in the first 5 years of life. But executive functions also depend on the environment to develop to their full potential. And in particular, children need sensitive, high quality interactions with their caregivers to develop executive functions to their full potential, to their maximum. So we can imagine that children who grew up in families or in home environments that are saturated by screens may have less opportunities to experience these kinds of rich, high quality interactions with their caregivers. So with colleagues at New York University, we found that children's screen time during the preschool years is negatively related to school readiness, so replicating what we found with the Canadian data. And we also found that part of the association, so part of the effect of screen time on school readiness seems to be explained by decreases in executive functions. And we also found in this sample that was diverse in terms of socioeconomic status, we found that the association between screen time and executive functions was especially pronounced. So it was especially marked for children from low income families. So low income children seem to be more vulnerable to the negative impact of screen time. And I think this is of concern since, at least in North America, the highest or the fastest growing increase in screen time is observed in low socioeconomic status families. So children from more disadvantaged families are increasing at a faster rate, their level of screen time consumption. And considering the importance of executive functions, I think this is of concern because if these trends continue, we might expect a widening of the school readiness gap, the socioeconomic school readiness gap. So I'm now going to talk about some of my work on media use by adolescents and its impact on their well-being and mental health. And then I'll end by talking about some of my current research. So I think it's interesting and important to look at adolescents separately from young children. And this is because, first of all, the characteristics of adolescents are different. So their individual characteristics differ. And this can influence how they respond to digital media use. So adolescents are more sensitive to peer influence, they're more prone to sensation seeking, and they're more impulsive. In addition to this, the way adolescents use media is different from younger children. So adolescents are more likely to use media without supervision from adults or caregivers. They're more involved in gaming and they're more involved in social media. Finally, there's also, I think it's important to keep track of some differences between boys and girls. So boys and girls use media for approximately the same amount of time. However, their media diets are slightly different. So boys are more involved in gaming and are more likely to access adult-only websites or pornography, whereas girls are more likely to use social media and to be involved in chatting or texting behavior. So here's some data from a Canadian national sample of adolescents. This is a representative sample of 40,000 adolescents across Canada. And I just want to draw your attention to the yellow bars on this graph. So the yellow bars are the proportion of Canadians who are not respecting the 2-hour minimum of screen time. So they're going over 2 hours of screen time per day. And they're also not meeting the 1 hour minimum recommended physical activity hours. So they're insufficiently physically active and too much screen time. And as you can notice, this is approximately half adolescents across the country. So many adolescents seem to be struggling with their ability to follow these recommendations and to develop or maintain healthy media habits. And this is not by accident. So media actually, and especially the newer devices, were developed by teams of experts in learning psychology, in behavioral economics, in learning psychology to develop products that would be used habitually and repeatedly and often. So these companies did not miss their mark they were very successful. Adults have on average 30 to 150 interactions per day with their phones. And according to a very concerning statistic, approximately 1 in 3 Americans admitted in a questionnaire that they'd rather give up sex than their telephone. So is adolescents' screen time related to their well-being? So here, using the same sample I just described, we used a sample of 40,000 adolescent Canadians. And in this sample, the youth themselves self-reported their screen time, and they also self-reported certain indicators of well-being. And this is a cross-sectional study. So we can just look at the highlighted parts of the graph here, and I'll summarize for you. Essentially, what we found is that time spent viewing TV or movies, playing video games, or using the internet were consistently negatively associated with different indicators of well-being. So more time with media was negatively linked to academic grades. Media use was also linked with less school connectedness, so less feeling of belonging to school, less liking of school. Media use also was negatively linked to the adolescent's self-esteem, their level of physical activity, and their dietary habits. And these associations were adjusted for certain confounders like ethnicity and sex, as well as some health risk behaviors like cigarette smoking, cannabis use, and binge drinking. So the research I just presented to you was correlational and cross-sectional. So important here, and you've probably heard this before over and over again, correlation is not causation. And just because two things are linked, we cannot say that one caused the other. And it could very well be the case that adolescents who are not doing well in school, are disinterested in school, don't feel good about themselves, simply choose to spend more time with media as a means of escaping or as a means of self-medication. So issues of reverse causality are very important to keep in mind in this type of research. I think it's also important to note that much of the research in this field is correlational. And it's not because we're bad researchers or we don't know better. It's simply because it would be very difficult to invite 40,000 youth into the lab, assign them to different media habits, send them back in the world, and then see what happens. So in these kinds of population level studies, we're often bound by correlational designs. However, there are certain statistical techniques that we can use that allow us to at least see if the pattern of associations is consistent with the causal explanation. And I'm going to present an example of such a technique here. So random intercept cross-lag panel models can be very useful when you have longitudinal data, especially when you have data that's repeated measures over time. So the advantage of this kind of approach is that, first of all, it does allow us to establish the precedence of our predictor in time. So we can really see, is it the A happening before B or B happening before A? It also allows us to look at stability in constructs and variables over time. And importantly, it allows us to examine variance at two levels and two sources of variance. So it allows us to examine between-person variance, and between-person variance is typically what we look at in an ANOVA, in a regression model, and it's very commonly used. And it allows us to answer the following question. Does Thelma, who spends more time online than Louise, have more symptoms of depression than Louise? So we're essentially comparing people to each other in this way. And this is fine, but there could be many pre-existing differences between Thelma and Louise that complicate our interpretation. Now, within-person variance is very interesting because it allows us to see, does Thelma's internet use at 13 predict her own symptoms of depression at age 15? So we're comparing each person to their own baseline, and we're taking into account individual differences and the fact that not everybody is equal in terms of their baseline depression and their baseline internet use. So it's typically a more powerful measure of change and is more consistent with most causal explanations of change in the social sciences. So this is some recent data from my group in which we looked at girls' internet use and their depression symptoms over time. And what we could see first off is that between the ages of 13 and 17, there is consistency in depression symptoms. So there's a positive correlation across time. We can also see that across internet use between the ages of 13 and 17, there's also some consistency. So there's continuity in internet use. Now, I think what's of particular interest here are the crossed associations. So it's a cross-lag model because we want the cross associations. And what we can see, first of all, is that so the dotted lines are non-significant and the full lines are significant. Internet use at age 13 predicts an increase in depression at age 15, and same thing between 15 and 17. So internet use at 15 is predicting more depression at age 17. But if we look at the reverse association in the other direction, depression is not driving more internet use at age 15, and nor is the case at 17. So we have a little bit of evidence here that the causality or the direction of association does seem to be going in one direction. And in my lab, we've used similar advanced modeling techniques to look at the associations between screen time and the development of pro-social behavior during adolescence. So more screen time was associated with reduced pro-social behavior, less altruistic behavior towards others. And we also found that video game playing is associated with increased risk of ADHD symptoms, but not the other way around. So up to date, I've been talking a lot about screen time, so the duration of use of different types of screens, and it's a very important dimension of children and adolescents' media diets. But it's not the only dimension that is important to consider. So I mentioned previously that, for example, exposure to violent contents might pose additional risks. There's very limited work to date also looking at how exposure to gender, racial, or other stereotypes might also influence the healthy development of children and their self-esteem. So it's another aspect of children's media diets, I think, that merits increased attention. And on the other end, there's also decades of research that suggests that high-quality programming, such as Sesame Street, can actually make a difference, positive difference in improving children's school readiness if viewed in moderation. In addition to content, I think a related concept is the function of use. So children are not all doing the same thing with screens. So some children may be very passively watching videos on YouTube, whereas other children might be actively communicating through video chats. And these are likely to have very different outcomes depending on how much of the different activities the child is doing. And lastly, another important dimension that's been understudied is the context of use. So the rules that are set in a family, or how parents use screens, or the presence of background media, parental co-viewing, and the times and locations. So if children are using media during meal times or directly before going to sleep, these are all likely also to influence risks and or positive outcomes of media use. So in addition to these additional dimensions of children's media diets, I think that research also needs to pay more attention to children's individual differences and how these might moderate, buffer, amplify, or even protect them against different types of media use. Sorry, so these can include age, sex, ethnicity, and also behavioral characteristics of the child or their physical strengths and limitations. So in addition to these, to considering media diets more comprehensively, I think we need to pay more attention to explanatory mechanisms to try and understand what is explaining associations between media use and different outcomes for children. So the displacement hypothesis is often put forward in the scientific literature to explain the negative impact of screen time on children's development. So this essentially states that when children spend time with screens, they have less time for other more important activities that are essential for health and development, such as sleep, physical activity, real-life interactions with family members or friends. We also know, however, that, for example, through social learning theory, that children learn by observing models around them. So this is often going to be their parents and their brothers and sisters, but children can also choose to model a character from their favorite movie or from their favorite video game. And finally, there is exposures to certain contents may be disruptive to children's attentional systems and to their reward systems. And I think these kinds of mechanisms become important and useful for understanding why media use might have a negative impact on academic achievement and mental health. So media and technology change very rapidly. And it's often hard for researchers to keep up with how quickly media is changing and how quickly they're being absorbed into people's families. So for one thing, portable devices right now have very much changed how families use media. So it's the use of portable devices has become a lot more personalized. It's used intermittently for short periods of time, and it's used during other activities. So these characteristics have made portable devices extremely popular, but also make their measurement by researchers very complicated. It's very hard to measure these accurately. So since 2016, I am part of the CAFE Consortium, which is an international group of researchers scattered across the globe, mostly in the Northern Hemisphere. And our objective was to develop modern and more reliable tools for measuring family media use. So to date, we've developed 3 tools. The first is a questionnaire, an online questionnaire that has over 70 items that measure not just the duration of children's use, not just screen time, but also function, content, and some elements around the context of use. We've also developed a digital diary that allows parents to record all of their activities over a period of 24 hours, including media activities. And for the media activities, some follow-up questions allow parents to record the context of use and the content of use. And finally, we've developed an application that can be downloaded onto portable devices, tablets, or phones to continuously measure app use throughout the day and device use throughout the day. So since 2020, I'm directing a study trying to essentially, the initial objective of the study was to validate the CAFE assessment in a Canadian sample. However, my study ended up coinciding with the pandemic. So it became a media use during the pandemic study. So our study began in 2020, where we collected data from just over 300 Nova Scotian families. And then we've also completed a second assessment with these families in 2021. And we are currently collecting a third wave of data from these families in Nova Scotia. So during these 3 waves, we're collecting detailed media use habits, as well as certain child outcomes. We're also collecting data on the children's temperament and a lot of information on the family context. So the level of parenting stress and socioeconomic information and disruptions that the families experienced because of the COVID-19 pandemic. So in our study, most of the children are located in the urban area of Halifax, which is the major city in Nova Scotia, but our participants are scattered across the province. So the objective currently of our third wave of study is to better understand how children's media use contributes to their physical, cognitive, and personal social development. So we're conducting home visits to get these measures directly. So we're measuring physical activity and sleep with an accelerometer. An accelerometer is a little belt that the child wears for a week that really precisely measures how physically active, how sedentary, and when they're sleeping. We're also collecting data on upper and lower body strength, BMI, waist circumference, and dexterity and balance to look at their motor development. We're evaluating their executive functions and language development. And in terms of personal and social development, we're looking at their level of empathy, how they express negative emotions, their social withdrawal, and quality of interactions with peers. We are also in the next, in the wintertime, in our wintertime, your summertime, we'll be contacting the children's teachers to see how they're doing in the classroom and how they're adjusting to the school environment. So we will be collecting information on their academic grades, their classroom engagement, whether they have behavior problems in the classroom, attention problems, their self-esteem, and their gender role development. So to date, from this longitudinal study, we have a couple publications that I'll just describe for you briefly here. So our first study, we looked at the media habits of these families during the pandemic. And we found that, well, first off, that the vast majority, 64% of 3-year-olds were spending over 2 hours a day with screens. So I just remind you that the recommendation is 1 hour per day. So they're going vastly beyond this recommended amount of time. And we also found that the majority of children were being exposed to media during the hour before bedtime, which itself poses risks for sleep quality and other health problems. In terms of risk factors, so children with more difficult temperaments, lower income families, and parents who themselves spent more time with screens had children with worse media habits. We've also looked at children's screen time during the pandemic and how that relates to their development of effortful control, which is a dimension of temperament, fairly stable dimension of temperament. And we found that more screen time during the pandemic was associated with worse effortful control. And this is controlling for the opposite direction of effect. We also found that more screen time during the pandemic at age 3 was linked to more difficulty managing negative emotions 1 year later. Again, controlling for the opposite effect, opposite direction. So to end up, I'm just going to talk briefly about some of the work from my students. They were very excited, very, very excited that I was going to share their work with you today. So my master's student, Marie-André, is looking at screen time habits during the pandemic and how that relates to children's global development. And she's found some negative effects, particularly for children that are heavy users. So she's looking at groups of media users. So the heavy users seem to be suffering the most. My student, Alexa Johnson, is looking at the parents' screen time, controlling for the child's screen time, and has found that parents who themselves spend more time with screens have children who score lower on assessments of global development. My doctoral student is looking at background media. So she's looking at how exposure to television in the background that the children's not specifically watching contributes to their cognitive and language development. My postdoctoral intern, Mayra Lopez Almeida, who's from Universidad Federal de Rio Grande del Sur, so she did her PhD in Porto Alegre, is looking at how social support and the family ecology contribute to the family's media habits. And my other postdoctoral intern, who's also from Brazil, coincidentally, from University of São Paulo, is using complex longitudinal designs to investigate how school-aged children's media habits contribute to their mental health. So just as a conclusion, I think that moving forward to advance research in this area, it's going to be important to consider multiple dimensions of children's media diets in addition to the screen time. I think to inform effective interventions, it's going to be important to test out different mechanisms of action and to understand what are the mechanisms of action at play. And finally, I think we need to know more about which children are likely to be more vulnerable to negative impacts of media by considering individual differences. And I think this way we'll gain eventually a better picture of some of the risks, but also the benefits that can come from media use habits. So, Brigada, thank you for listening to me. And I also want to thank, obviously this is not work that was done only by me. There was a large team of people, of students, of research assistants, of mentors, of colleagues that have all enriched my work. I'd like to also thank the funding agencies that have provided support, Université de Sherbrooke and Universidad Federal de Bahia, also for inviting me today. And if these topics interest you,
you can finish, Caroline. Would you like to talk about this topic?
It's just if anybody's interested by these topics, to please, you can please write to me or feel free to write to me.
So thank you, Caroline, for your amazing presentation. I think it was a wonderful overview of your research. This is a very comprehensive approach. It's amazing, all the things you're doing. And it's also a beautiful teaching on research methodology for our students, because you really show how to do the research from the theoretical foundations, a beautiful design, and showing your first results. It's also very impacting, because we see only negative effects so far. So I'll translate.
Yeah.
Bom, gente, então eu estava aqui parabenizando, né, a Caroline pela apresentação e agradecendo tanto pelo panorama, né, que ela fez para a gente, quanto porque foi uma aula de metodologia da pesquisa, né? Como é que se faz a pesquisa desde os fundamentos teóricos, um design, um delineamento longitudinal, os primeiros resultados, né? Mas a gente também fica muito impactado porque os efeitos, como vocês puderam ver, são basicamente negativos sobre o desenvolvimento, né? Então, acho que vamos aproveitar agora, né, o tempo que a gente tem para tirar o máximo aqui da Caroline, né, saber tudo que vocês têm interesse, se vocês quiserem falar um pouco sobre a pesquisa que vocês estão fazendo, né, mesmo que não tenha diretamente a ver com o assunto. Ela trabalha muito com famílias que são socio-vulneráveis, né? Eu acho que esse é o tema de muitas das pesquisas. Então, agora, fiquem à vontade para perguntar. Vocês podem perguntar em português, podem perguntar em inglês, como vocês quiserem.
I'd like to learn more about the social low economy families, because I'm in Brazil, we have a lot of people that don't have access to internet, for example. Mm-hmm. So how to measure that? How to know the effects of the without access of internet? I'm not sure if we're clear.
Yeah, it's a population that...
Just a moment, Carol. Traduza. Eu acho que eu não sei também se o pessoal ouviu.
Na verdade, a minha ideia era um pouco perguntar como é que a gente pode avaliar isso nas famílias socioeconomicamente vulneráveis, né? Já que no Brasil a gente tem uma questão anterior, que é a ausência de acesso às tecnologias, à mídia, etc. E a gente também conhece alguns efeitos positivos disso, né? Então, como é que a gente pode avaliar essa ausência de acesso à internet como um fator de risco também?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think in Canada, most even our disadvantage, and I guess we could refer to relative disadvantage. Most of them will have access to the internet, though that there's maybe a 5% of people that don't have access to internet. But in our in the Nova Scotia study, in our pandemic study, it was a requirement that participants had to have access, because we at the start we couldn't do any in-person activities, so we had to be able to send everything online. So these are limited to people that have access to the internet. But even in our relatively homogeneous, not terribly vulnerable sample, we find effects based on income. So relative income differentials are associated with the screen time. By parents' education as well, we find typically differences in the screen time. So even in lower levels of relative deprivation, I think there seems to be an SES effect.
It's more of a comment. Is that I noticed what my teacher said about the low incomes, and I see it. I think there would be a difference on the low incomes, like in a position of like an urban area, a city. There's a different scenario of a lower income in a city and a low income or a rural area, a very distant area from like isolated from this society. So the difference of the low income of those scenarios would probably be different, and it would show up in how much internet use is on that, because you saw that low incomes probably in a more urban area, urban scenario had this effect of like more internet usage. But if you're thinking of like rural area like Brazil, when there's a lot of people who are more in isolated places, or they are like, it's different to have Wi-Fi because of a more risky situation of housing. It shows up probably not so much in a higher amount of internet usage, but more probably lower. But there's probably, like in the big urban centers of Brazil, there's probably some correlations of low income with higher usage. So it is, Brazil is that place with a lot of complexity and a lot of a different world, different worlds, basically.
Yeah. And something I'd be interested to know more about is families. How popular television use is, or do people use some kind of data plans to use it if they don't have internet? What is the alternative media use in cases where families don't have internet? Because I'm assuming that there's some kind of go around where people can still use screens in different ways.
Yeah, where television is more used than like computers or
Absolutely.
Or something like that. Since Brazil has a special kind of media with telenovelas, and that is a different culture of media.
And interestingly enough, what children tend to do on iPads and computers is still watching television shows. Mm-hmm. So whether you're watching on the iPad or watching on the screen, there might be some slight physiological differences because of the proximity of the screen, but it's the same type of content. So television programs is still very popular amongst preschool kids, or movies. It's still a very common activity.
So I've been reading I've been reading a lot of research on the development of parasocial relationships, and I was thinking about it because when you talked about the industries that, their interest is to get people and adolescents to like participate in not normal relationships, but relationships with celebrities or like with companies, and the impacts of this and like quality relationships, it interests me a lot, because when you choose to have a relationship with a celebrity instead of with people around you, like what's the impact of that in your lifestyle, you know? Yeah. And but in the research that I found and the articles I had been reading, it also says like liking celebrities and getting into these industries of entertainment are also a way to find common interest with people on the internet.
Yeah.
So you maybe these people have difficulties making friends with and like relating to people because of the internet usage. Then they find an answer to that on more internet usage. So what gets me thinking is how the whole system just feeds itself.
Yeah.
And how important it is for us to research more about that.
And then you can find your therapy online as well, right? To deal with all that.
How do you escape that? Like,
it's so interesting. There's a few things I wanted to comment about that. First off, yes, I think that the loop idea is a bit of a scary one. But with the interactions with influencers or others online, I think it depends on, like, social media itself is probably not terrible. It's not evil. It's how youth use them. And there was an interesting study done now. It's getting old. You'll tell because it was done on Facebook, but it was a study on Facebook use. And what they found was that adolescents who reported having more friends. So the more friends you had, the more symptoms of depression and the higher your cortisol level was. So more stress with more friends. However, more interactions, lower cortisol rates. So really there seems to be something in the way that you're using social media. So there can probably be a way to really use it in a very healthy way, safe way to maximize well-being. But I think unfortunately, and for me, I don't have a detailed measure of their use, but it just seems like the way most people are using is not beneficial to mental health and well-being. It doesn't mean it can't be taught and it can't be changed and it can't be encouraged. I'm also very happy that you brought up parasocial relations, because for younger kids, so 6 to 7, and it's going to be their parasocial relationship with a character. So it's going to be favorite movie character, and I'm using a questionnaire on parasocial relationships for the first time. So maybe if you want to talk more about that, we will have some data on that very soon. And I've included it to explore it, but it's not my expertise. So we can talk about that after if you like.
Caroline, sometimes it seems to me we still don't know how to deal with this new phenomenon that internet is. Sometimes I think these negative results are associated with our lack of knowledge about the educational processes involving all these situations. I'd like to listen to you talk about a little bit more about these educational processes, because sometimes I think, of course, internet per se, it's not positive or negative. It depends on the way we deal with it. What do you think about this?
Yeah, and I think when we start getting down to different types of usages and then getting into the details of the types of interactions and how that interacts also with individuals' predispositions. So there's a lot to consider, right? There's the characteristics of the user, the characteristics of the activity, specific contents within the activity. So we're very far from having a detailed understanding of all those characteristic elements. And like I said, my research is very, in a sense, very macro, because we're looking at internet use, which I think specifically was about how often they used social media, looked up information online, and they were asked to exclude internet use for schoolwork. So that can involve so many things. However, we did find consistent effects with the mental health, which to me suggests, as you're saying, that people are not using internet to the best of their capabilities. So they're not necessarily favoring usages that are good for them, that are good for their mental well-being. And I think that I don't think we can educate people. I don't think there's a one-fit-all model of how to educate, but I think we can teach people to be aware of their own signals. So if you feel empty after using the internet, if you spend more time than you wanted to, if you start feeling worse for yourself, try to reduce those usages and favor usages that put you in contact with other people, that allow you to socialize, that allow you to learn, or that allow you to positively express your identity. I think we can sort of start recommending that to people without too many risks. I think those are safe recommendations to make.
Do you have some data on using social media like Instagram or Facebook, like more contemplative usage versus interactive usage? Like
that's interesting. I think I don't have that data personally, but from what I've read, more interactive forms of usage. So talking to people, or posting thought pieces, sharing thoughts and information is more positive than scrolling. So passively looking, and then the scrolling, I think the literature on that is nothing new. It's old literature applied to social media. If you're making a lot of negative comparisons to others, and it can be especially powerful when it's your peer group. So yes, the influencers, but maybe even more pronounced when it's your peer group. If you're constantly negatively comparing, you will have a decrease in self-esteem, and there you can have the risk of depression. But if you're positively comparing, then the risks are not there, or maybe it's even a positive experience for the users.
You talked about a part about Sesame Street and school readiness. In Brazil, maybe Sesame Street is not as famous, but we do have other media that teaches arts and crafts and engages in creativity and research. And I was thinking, is there like any data on parental participation in these types of activities that are taught to children? For example, how to engage in moral or in arts and crafts, or
With the media?
Yeah,
Absolutely. There's so especially the younger the children, the more involved the parent is in all media activities, the more likely the child is to learn. So maybe with a few exceptions, like if there are maybe 4 or 5 Sesame Street, the child can watch alone and still learn. But for young children, there's very little educational benefit unless the parent is co-viewing and interacting with the child around the media. So I think that's an important distinction to make. Joint parent media use, joint engagement with the parent seems to be a precondition for learning.
It's interesting because my father learned how to write with Sesame Street, but my father is a man at his 50s, so he, in his childhood, he didn't have internet or cell phone, or so he learned how to write in a different world, simply. And I think today Sesame Street is not as common, at least here in Brazil, as it was in the past. But it's fun to know this kind of thing and to think of how we learn in different generations. How my father learned how to write and how I learned to write.
Yeah, interesting. I'm wondering if there's a Brazilian equivalent to Sesame Street.
Sesame Street is
Not on
It's translated. They translate it in Portuguese.
It's not popular, but not on TV. But we have I guess it's in YouTube, like Mundo Bita. It's like with songs and good artists that composed children's songs.
Yeah.
And beautiful images. Acho que esse é um bom exemplo, né? Mundo Bita.
Acho
Não.
que o mais próximo que chega de a questão dos fantoches é, talvez assim, programas da TV Cultura, no caso. O Caricó it's more like it's a program that's based on rural area of Brazil, so it's like a farm.
Okay.
And the animals talk and all of that, and there's this groundskeeper.
Maybe I can learn Portuguese if I watch that show. We'll see. I'll try.
But they are fairly unpopular, I guess.
Yeah, children don't watch them as much.
Not anymore.
It was popular when I was a
Yeah,
child.
when we were children. Not anymore.
Not anymore.
But still, it's very different when we're children because, I got my first cell phone when I was 12. My cousin, who was born in 2011, she got her first cell phone when she was 4, So it's completely different because in television, there's still like a way to, control what's being put on. In cell phones, you get to look at everything if your parents not watching.
Yeah.
But then again, it's a difference between my generation because when I got a cell phone, my parents didn't know they had to look into what I was looking at. So I got in contact with stuff that my cousin probably doesn't get in touch with because they know that. So there are some difference in that too.
Yeah, and there's generational differences that are going to be, I think, very apparent when these children that grew up, the native users that grew up with technology all around them and access to a smartphone. It's going to be interesting to see when they reach adolescence and become university students, how different they are from the previous generations that only had it for half their lives or part of their lives.
And what kind of tips you can give to the schools, for example, when the teachers, what can do about politics or suggest?
Teacher, are you, which level of teachers?
I think adolescents.
High school
Because,
teachers?
Yes, because after the pandemic world, you have a lot of adolescents with mental health problems.
Yeah.
Like depression and.
I think, I think with adolescents, the game is not, first of all, we can't tell them like to do this, do that. The other thing, I think they need to be just sensitized, empowered to pay attention to their own signals, to be mindful about their, I've heard people call it digital hygiene or media hygiene. So when they use media, they can think about, there are groups in Quebec that work with sensitizing youth to these issues. So they say, well, this is what the science say in a very well translated way. Like, okay, it might be risks for your sleep. So ask yourself questions. Am I sleeping well? So kind of like a self checklist for youth. I think that can be developed. There's another group that encourages not only adolescents, but also young adults and families to do a 24-hour without screens. And during that time, they have all kinds of activities, and they also ask people after to reflect on how they felt after 24 hours without screens. And a lot of youth report, well, oh my God, I didn't realize how automatic I used it. Like, I'm always reaching for my phone. Like, I didn't realize I use it out of boredom all the time. So I think those are interesting strategies as well, like these kind of challenges to take a step back, basically, and think about the habits. And I think that media literacy also needs to be addressed. So I think adolescents are very clever. They can understand that companies use certain algorithms to keep them on social media. And I think just understanding the loops and how your data is used to keep you on social media can be very helpful for them too, to get a better handle on what they're doing and why they're using media.
Very interesting.
I'm not sure following the question about the pandemic influence and the studies, because I was trying to make a comparison with my own informal observations in my close family, and I was thinking how different it is to live an adolescence with 2 years of isolation because of the pandemic, because it was also kind of 2 years.
Yeah.
So I see my cousin in her high school years, which is chaotic by itself, but doing at home and how this affect her relationships with colleagues and school. And I see how the media can be very helpful to reunite, but can be very isolated too, because I can see how this now that the pandemic is kind of controlled, she is very anxious to be out, to be with her friends, much more than I would be in my high school years. So she has this urgency to get a new experience, but just I can see that they're just passing by. That this has this feeling of insatisfaction, and that she can experience things. And I think by what she talks to me, that is really correlated to the way she is engaging with her friends. It is some kind of data in
about the anxiety in adolescents after post pandemic.
Yeah, and this feeling of insatisfaction, to get new experiences, but not get a pleasure of it.
That's very interesting. I mean, it's maybe this idea of they're used to online interactions, and maybe the real life doesn't match up to those interactions. That could be something that's studied. But My sample during the pandemic are very young. They're 3 to 5, so we're hoping they're not on social media at that age. Really hoping.
Who knows? Do you have some hypotheses on the enhanced use by low-income families? Why is it happening right now?
Yeah, the increase is a bit surprising, but it's always, I think, been the case that lower income families, United States and Canada, will use more screens. And I think it's because there's been research showing that families that face more adversity, so mothers who struggle more with their mental health, that experience more stress, use more screens. And I think they use it as a coping strategy. They use it as a babysitter more. They might have more irregular hours. They might, be out of the house more. So I think, and there also was the issue possibly of them not being as educated about the consequences. But I think that's probably secondary. I think there's practical reasons, lack of resources, that make it so they use more screens with the child.
And I couldn't see in the TV when this increase became.
Wait, which years?
Yeah.
Yeah, that was data from, I think, 2015 to 2017.
2015.
Ending in 2017, and now during the pandemic recently, Common Sense Media looked at preteens, I think, a bit older, but there was a bit larger increase for low income.
Dos efeitos que foram trazidos durante a apresentação tem relação com a atenção e desempenho escolar. E é um fator, uma das características que fazem muitas escolas direcionarem crianças a profissionais para diagnóstico de TDAH, e que é um transtorno que está com a prevalência atualmente, mundialmente falando. Eu queria ouvir dela porque alguns autores estão discutindo, o impacto desse uso delas para diagnósticos problemáticos de TDAH. Eu queria ouvir se é um tema que através da pesquisa dela e como é que ela enxerga essa relação.
He wants to know more upon the relation between ADHD and screen time. If you are doing this in your research, if you have more data on it. Eu perdi pedaço sobre o diagnóstico. If it influences the diagnosis. If it has, maybe if it has to do with the beginning of the symptoms, if it's related, the use of
Right. So I'm gonna try and keep it short, so you don't have to translate too much.
You had a paper.
Yeah, so we do have a paper. We didn't look at diagnoses of ADHD because there were actually only like 3% in our sample that were diagnosed at 12 to 13. We looked at symptoms, so level of symptomology. So far we've done video games to ADHD symptoms we're starting to look at other elements of mental health in line with video games as well.
And they are associated.
We're finding, I'd have to ask Gabriel because he's working on it.
It's the Brazilian student.
Yeah, the Brazilian student. But yeah, we'd be happy to keep you updated with anything that comes up with the video games. I know that like internet use, video games, TV, they have different effects. So I think video games seems to be more linked to impulsive behavior and ADHD type of behavior. And it's not entirely surprising because there's work showing that the video games that are popular, not all video games, but the ones that are popular, do create big dopamine releases in the brain. They create tremendous dopamine releases. And when children are early adolescents, the brain's wiring itself, right? So too much dopamine during this rewiring time might make people sort of more prone to boredom, more prone to these types of ADHD-like symptoms when they're not getting that kind of reward. So I think that's what we propose as a hypothesis for those findings.
Que mais, gente?
I also think it's interesting to see how the children and adolescents change the internet the other way around. Not the internet changing them, but they molding the internet as we know it. Because I felt at least as someone growing up with the internet and see how it is changing over time with this new generation coming up. That like policies in social media has changed. YouTube is a lot more strict with what it shows up and what kind of advertisements it has and what you can say on YouTube and what you can say. And it is all about really making a safer space for children and adolescents because now they are present in that space where they weren't before. And they are really molding the type of content there is on the internet and the companies and a lot of people are focusing on them as a market in that place. Like I'm sure you're aware of like the family channels where they put children to play with toys or a lot of stuff that is really focused on them in a very exploratory manner. And really it shows like how the internet is molding itself to this intense new market. A lot of internet users are children and adolescents.
And there was even I don't know if I think it got pulled, but there was going to be an Instagram for kids, like that was being, and I think there was a backlash and they decided the project.
Só fechar o slide dela, aí na tela que vai assistir pedido do uso público.
Tá.
Não sei se tem perguntas lá também.
Depois a gente pode dar uma olhada.
Pronto. Yeah, and what was I going to say too? Yeah, and there's a tremendous market also for apps for children. And it's kind of like the companies are like, okay, well, they reach saturation with adults, and then they have to go find different markets. So the markets that are not yet saturated are the child markets, the preschooler markets, and the pre-adolescent markets. So we're going to see changes in that sense probably continue to happen.
Yeah, and speaking of what Lisa said here about like how the interactions in real life versus interactions in the internet, I think that maybe it's a lot about the control that you have when you speak with people in the internet. You can control what you're saying, you can control what you're showing, the image that you're showing to people. You can really control what persona you're showing to the world. And in real life, maybe my hair is out of place, something is on my teeth, I said the wrong thing. And you don't have that much control, and suddenly the perfection that social media allows you to have is breaking up in reality because that's not possible to have.
And it's a lot more effortful to communicate with somebody in person because you can't think and wait what you're going to say. You have to respond immediately to people, and you have to pay attention to what they're saying. You can't go back and read what they said. You have to. It's a lot more tiring and exhausting if you're used to only interacting online.
Let me check the questions in the chat here. Let me see. Malcolm, como é que eu vejo aqui? Não, só para ver se tem perguntas no chat aqui. É comentários?
Exato.
É no StreamYard?
É mesmo aí mesmo. Já tava aparecendo.
Opa!
Aperta ela de novo.
Aonde eu tava?
Comentários.
Comentários.
Aí. Pronto. São essas perguntas.
Ah, são só...
Isso.
São só comentários, né? Então...
I have one question about the sample. Marcus question about the
ADHD?
Yes. In the sample, there are a lot of typical plurality.
They were mostly typical population based, so typical neurotypical. Mostly, yeah. I think it was like maybe 3-5% were diagnosed with an ADHD, so it was a small amount.
It's a fairly recent news, but like the last couple of months, there's been a kind of media talking about Portuguese children that are in so I don't know how to put it, tanto contato, so much contact with Brazilian YouTubers that they're that they are losing their accent or they are not developing their accent. and if that could possibly be a cause for a lack of connection to their nationality, because they spend a lot of time watching us in our own culture, and when they return, they speak the same language, but they're not the same exactly.
Right. There was a similar preoccupation with, I don't know if you know the show Peppa Pig. It's a British show.
Yeah.
So kids were getting British accents, little kids, and the parents were like, what is happening? And it reminds me also of another concern. We had a consultation day with the Minister of Health on media use, and there were representatives from all kinds of different groups and interest groups, and there was representatives from our First Nations group, and they said that the First Nation youth are just eating up, consuming all this content that's designed by white people, by Canadians, and they're losing their culture. They're not gaining any exposure to culture. I mean, and again, I think it comes down to measure to how much. I think there is concerns of most popular media being designed by a small homogenous group of people, and some kids might not see themselves in that, and they might not get positive representations of their own group. So I think that those are important questions to ask.
Vou perguntar em português também. Eu estava conversando, né, sobre aqui, que eu fiz uma pesquisa sobre o YouTube, né, sobre o uso do YouTube pelas crianças. E uma coisa que me chamou muita atenção foi essa questão das funções do YouTube, né? E aí eu queria que você falasse um pouco mais sobre isso, porque me chamou a atenção que as crianças das escolas públicas, né, crianças que tinham menor poder socioeconômico, elas não apontavam funções de aprendizado. E as crianças das escolas particulares apontavam. Então, fico pensando muito sobre essas questões sociais que envolvem o aprendizado de para que serve a internet, né? E então, se você puder comentar um pouco mais sobre isso.
So she would like to know about the functions of internet usage, particularly YouTube, because she did a research on that.
Yeah.
And compared low-income children with middle-class children. And the first ones, they don't talk about learning games from YouTube. Whereas middle-class children would talk about that they learn things.
They learn, interesting. So we do have data on YouTube use, not what they were doing on YouTube. So we have another few questions where parents reported, they like watching animal videos, or they do this or that or the other thing. But we do have some YouTube data that we haven't analyzed on its own as maybe, and that might be something of interest if you wanted to sort of look at some of your questions quantitatively as a, just sort of a parallel kind of look at that. We could see if there's differences between the socioeconomic statuses and the YouTube use, and maybe if there's any positive outcomes that come from the YouTube use. Everything's gonna happen.
Eu conectei aqui. O que será que foi então? Conectado.
Foi.
Não está funcionando, né?
Agora foi?
Obrigada. This is it, Karen? Can I translate?
Yeah.
Então, ela falou que ela tem dados sobre o uso de YouTube. Precisa? Então tá. Ok.
I would like to comment on the thing that to me is more important, that this research is very interesting, and it was done in Canada. But here in Brazil, we have 30 to 40 million people who don't have access to internet.
Yeah.
So it is very different. And I was thinking that here, it is not the rich people that use less internet. It's the people who. So to me, the people that are around me, they have some kind of money. They are not poor. They are not rich. They are like middle class. Yes, and they they use internet a lot more, and they have video games that here are very expensive. I mean, very. It's like 5 minimum wage salaries here, and rich people have these things, and poor people don't. So poor people usually they go on the streets to play soccer or to interact more than rich people here in Brazil. At least it's my experience. So it's different, and I would like to see a research made here in Brazil, because I think that this is very interesting to know our data also. And I would like to ask if you have some kind of indication to make, if you have some you students researching here or in other country that is similar to here in social questions.
I'm actually working with a group led in Canada, but collaborations with universities, and I can't remember who's the partner in Brazil, but there's a partnership with Brazil, Morocco, Kenya, Norway, Canada. The idea is to, in all these countries, collect data from 200 urban and 200 rural children on their screen time habits, but also focus on physical activity, sleep. So sort of it's more of a health behavior kind of study, but there will be some data on media use in these children. Now, obviously, I don't know in a sample that size how possible it will be to capture these children that are living in more severe disadvantage, where there's no internet connection, or children living in favelas. I cannot say if that group will be adequately represented in this study. But I think Giana's group at URGS is doing media research with Brazilian populations. She has been doing that for a little bit of time now. Yeah.
Tem grupo na URGS que faz bastante pesquisa nessa área. O nome da pesquisadora é Giana Friso, com 2 Es.
Comment on what she said, I think it's interesting also because it's a lot of complexities of all the complex hierarchies. And there is like one specific that we call like low middle class. That is like they don't have the money to pay like higher expensive video games and stuff like that, but they do have the income to pay everyone in their house to have a phone or something like it. And for me, it's interesting to see because they have, I don't know the studies, but they may have a higher usage of internet and stuff like that, because I think of the situation in Brazil, really the violence and the conditions of other ways to have fun. These people don't have access to cinemas, they don't have access to sports easily. So in that case, the only way they can have fun, they can have entertainment is by phones, by the way that they can be protected. But they just will have to go out and put themselves in a difficult situation because the transport is bad, or the situations of violence are bad, so they are afraid to go out.
And that's kind of the case, and I forgot to mention that earlier, with the lower socioeconomic populations in Canada, North America, is that they also use screens because they can't afford to do, play hockey, play soccer, go baseball classes, and they might live in neighborhoods that are less safe to run outside and play. So the parents keep them inside, and screens is a way to do that.
And in addition to that, I wonder if adolescents are also influenced on by all those in Netflix series that display really mean characters, like it's all about sociopaths and don't you think so?
There's a lot of
that.
There's a lot of social and verbal aggression in popular Netflix shows. It's very, very often portrayed.
So it's easier for an adolescent to think that the world is like this, that there are many mean people, bad people out there. So I'd better stay here, protected in my home.
It's called the mean world hypothesis. It's been studied in social psychology that if you watch a lot of it doesn't even have to be specifically violent programming, but a lot of programs with verbal aggression, relational aggression, over time you can develop this mean world hypothesis, and that's the belief that the world is a lot scarier and dangerous and full of people with bad intentions. And it's like an irrational view of the world.
The same happens for love interests. I saw research on like Korean media and the representation of men in Korean media. So all those novellas they put out with perfect men, and how, especially like teenagers that come in contact with this perfect man, they expect other men in the world to live up to the expectation. And when they don't, they decide not to engage in love relationships because of that. So like how the impact of what you consume and what you in social psychology, what you begin to form as a representation of what is good impacts on your daily life, not only on how you are in social media.
Yeah, it can influence your social norms and expectations. Absolutely.
Just comments on the college side. There's a lot of studies that show that Japanese people and Korean people are choosing not have any kind of relationship, love or sex relationship. It's insane.
Is it because of their media diets, do you think? Interesting.
Also because of their unrealistic beauty standards that they have, they are very unhealthy. Korean Japanese people have very unhealthy beauty standards of very specific kind of people with that's why Korea is I think the place that does the most
plastic
surgery in the world, and people begin to have that very early. I think like 60 years old they begin they use their birthday because of plastic surgery in their eyes to make them look more Western.
Wow.
But the stereotypes do be feed by social media.
Yeah.
So a student of our program is asking you, she's telling you that she is doing research on playing habits of adolescents that have cancer. And they often report the use of social media, and it seems to her that the use is protective. Let me see why. And she thinks there are just a few studies about playful interactions between adolescents.
Yeah, the chatting is probably one of the better activities that they can do. So if they're chatting and using social media to be in touch with others and be playful and share stories or sharing, memes or otherwise, those are probably not the worst usages, but the more passive types of use of media, so just scrolling through content, seems to be what's more negative to the well-being and mental health of adolescents.
Mais alguma questão, gente? Ainda temos um tempo.
Eu fico pensando sobre o que é que poderia, que poderia ser preditor da quantidade da exposição à tela. Como é que posso dizer? Assim, o que leva uma criança ou um adolescente a ver mais ou não. E lembrando de algumas coisas que eu ouvi das crianças e de outras pesquisas que ouviram crianças sobre isso, né? E de que muitas demonstram a preferência de fazer coisas fora da tela. Então, eu me lembro muito de uma fala que eu ouvi de uma criança de que ela estava vendo o YouTube, mas que se alguém chamasse para jogar futebol, que ela levantava na hora e ia jogar futebol, né? E eu acho que me parece que tem uma chave aí da gente entender por que essas escolhas, né? Que não está só nas telas, né? Na internet, mas nessas outras atividades, na disposição disso, né?
Patrícia, inclusive, a pesquisa de Bianca mostra isso. Quando ela pergunta para as crianças, né? Por que vocês brincam com tanta tecnologia? Porque é isso que vocês dão para a gente brincar. Entendeu? Então, realmente tem essa...
So she would like to know about other predictors of exposure, the length, the duration of the exposure to social media, because in her research, children reported that they would prefer playing outdoors or doing other kind of stuff and not the media. If someone calls them to do something else, they would always prefer that instead of the media.
That's very interesting.
And there's another research from a colleague that showed that she asked children, why do you stay so much time using digital media? And children told her, because this is the only thing we have, the only thing you give us to do.
That is very interesting.
You offer.
We so in our sample, unlike in your research, we didn't talk to the children themselves. It was reported by the parents. Mm-hmm. But for the young children, we did have some predictors of the length of their media use, and they were the parents' income, so lower income, more screen time, children with more difficult temperaments, so the ones that are more likely to throw fits, scream, anger, the parents probably use more screens with them to calm them down. So it kind of fits with the family distress model. And then on the positive end, we found that parents who set limits and follow limits and have rules of when to turn off the TV and which contents the child can watch, have children that spend less time in front of screens, both concurrently and prospectively.
Mm-hmm. I guess a structured routine too,
yeah.
Isn't it?
So the structured routine is actually what's recommended with young children, is to use a family plan and a structured routine and to stick with it.
Temos tempo para mais uma pergunta. Mais alguém quer perguntar?
I would try to say English, but I don't have sure if I can do this. All right. I want to go more specifically about if you believe that have some relationship about between this kind of application that have the model of videos, they have is very short, that have scrolling in the DDH. I don't have how to say English.
But which app is this? It's a type
it's like
of app.
Some correlation. Called is this
between scrolling and ADHD?
Yes. DDH.
Scrolling and ADHD. I don't have that. Scrolling and ADHD. I don't have that data. But one thing that's interesting that's starting to come out is multiple use of screens. So, for example, you're watching TV and you have your cell phone, and you're scrolling or doing something at the same time. They call it multi-screen use. It seems to be very, very bad for cognitive, executive functions and cognitive functioning. So I don't know if they're going to find that maybe ADHD kids are more likely to choose that type of screen use because they need to be stimulated more. Or if we're going to find that kind of screen use is a predictor of declining cognitive functioning. But I think that's something to watch out for also in the next.
So this should be strongly avoided.
I think there's some neuroscientific research that's found some pretty alarming concerning.
Like professors at the computer and the phone at the same time.
And then the task switching is terrible. Task switching is terrible.
Bom, gente, tem mais alguma pergunta? Ainda temos 5 minutos. Então, quero agradecer, em primeiro lugar, a Caroline, mais uma vez, por estar aqui conosco. Eu espero que essa seja a primeira vez de vários encontros, nos próximos anos, com mais resultados de pesquisa, se possível, com colaboração aqui com a UFBA, Acho que foi bastante proveitoso. So, Caroline, thank you very much. We hope this was the first of many meetings and lectures we'll have, hopefully with collaboration with our university.
Yes.
So thank you very much. Muito obrigada, gente, pela presença. Can we have now 5 minutes before our next meeting? 5 minutes for bathroom and water?
Muito obrigada. Oh, thank you.